The jungle is silent. Somewhere beneath the thick canopy of Vietnam, Viet Cong fighters lie motionless in the undergrowth. Their rifles are ready. Claymore mines are wired. The trail ahead is narrow, muddy, perfect for an ambush. They've done this dozens of times before. Then the Americans appear. A small patrol moves slowly through the trees, boots sinking into the wet ground, eyes scanning the jungle that seems alive with shadows. The Viet Cong wait. A few more steps, and the trap will close. But before anyone fires a rifle, a strange, hollow sound echoes through the jungle. Thump. For a split second, no one understands what it means. Then something drops into the middle of the hidden position. The explosion rips through the foliage, shattering branches and tearing apart the carefully prepared ambush. Fighters who believed they were invisible suddenly find the jungle itself exploding around them. Confusion spreads instantly. The Americans haven't even seen them, yet they're already under attack. But the most terrifying part of the M79 wasn't the explosion. It was what the Viet Cong realized after hearing it. The weapon that just shattered that ambush was the American M79 grenade launcher, a weapon so unusual that soldiers gave it a nickname, the Thumper. At first glance, it looked almost simple, just a single-shot launcher carried by one infantryman. But in the jungles of Vietnam, that single soldier could suddenly do something no rifleman could. He could strike enemies hiding behind trees, inside trenches, or deep inside bunkers that were supposed to make guerrilla fighters untouchable. And that changed everything. Because the Viet Cong relied on one advantage above all others, the ability to remain unseen. Their ambushes were designed to hit fast, disappear into the jungle, and overwhelm American patrols before they could react. But the M79 began to break that advantage. By the end of this video, you'll understand why a single American soldier carrying the M79 could completely change the outcome of a firefight in the Vietnamese jungle, and why many Viet Cong fighters eventually learned to recognize the sound of the weapon itself, seconds before it was already too late. To understand why the M79 became so feared, you first have to understand the battlefield where it was used. Vietnam was not a conventional war. Most of the fighting didn't happen across open fields or clearly defined front lines. It happened inside one of the most difficult combat environments on Earth, the dense jungles of Southeast Asia. Visibility was often limited to just a few meters. Thick vegetation swallowed sound and movement. Trails twisted through forests so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. For American soldiers, every step forward carried the same question: is someone watching us right now? For the Viet Cong, this environment was an advantage. They fought a war built on guerrilla tactics. Instead of large battles, they relied on ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and sudden disappearances back into the jungle. Fighters would hide along narrow jungle paths, waiting for American patrols to move into carefully prepared kill zones. They built bunkers reinforced with logs and soil. They dug tunnels that allowed them to move unseen beneath the ground. They fired from behind trees, trenches, and thick walls of vegetation where they were nearly impossible to spot. When the shooting started, the firefights were usually fast and close. Bullets snapped through the trees from enemies that soldiers often couldn't even see. And that was the problem. The standard weapons carried by American troops' rifles like the M16 were designed for direct fire. To hit the enemy, you first had to see the enemy. But in the jungle, the Viet Cong were masters of staying hidden. They could attack from behind cover, disappear into bunkers, or vanish into the vegetation before American soldiers even understood where the fire was coming from. And that meant something crucial was missing from the battlefield. American soldiers needed something that could hit enemies they couldn't even see. The solution began to take shape in the early 1960s. American military planners knew that infantry units needed something more than rifles and machine guns. Soldiers needed a weapon that could reach enemies hiding behind cover, something that could strike into trenches bunkers, and dense vegetation without requiring direct line of sight? The answer was a weapon that looked surprisingly simple. It was called the M79 grenade launcher. Unlike complex machine guns or automatic weapons, the M79 was a single-shot launcher carried by one soldier in the patrol. It broke open like a large shotgun, allowing the operator to load a 40-millimeter high-explosive grenade before closing the weapon and firing. When the trigger was pulled, the launcher produced a distinctive, hollow sound. Thump. That sound earned the weapon its nickname among American troops, the Thumper. But what followed that sound was far more important. The grenade arced through the air and detonated with enough explosive force to send lethal fragments across several meters. An enemy fighter hiding behind a tree, inside a trench, or behind a dirt bunker could suddenly find himself directly in the blast zone. The M79 could fire effectively out to roughly 350 meters, far beyond the distance where soldiers could clearly see targets inside thick jungle vegetation. And despite its power, the weapon was remarkably simple. No complex mechanisms, no automatic firing system. Just one grenade at a time, loaded and fired by a trained grenadier. That simplicity made it reliable in one of the harshest combat environments imaginable: heat, humidity, mud, and constant jungle rain. And in combat, the effect could be immediate. Imagine a Viet Cong bunker hidden beneath layers of logs and dirt. From the outside, it might be invisible, nothing more than a patch of jungle floor. American soldiers moving past it might never even know it was there. But a grenadier carrying the M79 could change that. With a single shot, a grenade could drop directly into the bunker entrance or explode just outside it, sending fragments through the confined space inside. An ambush that had taken hours to prepare could be destroyed in seconds. For the first time, American infantry had a portable weapon that could strike enemies who believed they were completely protected. It was a powerful solution to one of the jungle's biggest problems. But the M79 had something far more dangerous than its explosive power. What made the M79 truly terrifying was not just its explosive power. It was how the weapon fought the jungle itself. In most firefights, soldiers needed a clear line of sight. Rifles, machine guns, even sniper weapons all relied on seeing the enemy before pulling the trigger. The M79 didn't. Instead of firing bullets in a straight line, the grenade launcher fired its rounds in a high, arcing trajectory. The grenade could rise above the trees, travel over obstacles, and then drop down into places that were supposed to be safe. Behind a tree trunk, inside a trench, at the entrance of a hidden bunker. A Viet Cong fighter could be completely concealed behind thick vegetation, believing the jungle had made him invisible. But invisibility meant nothing if an explosive grenade landed right behind the cover. The fragmentation effect made it even worse. When the 40-millimeter grenade detonated, it didn't just produce a blast. The metal casing shattered into dozens of high-velocity fragments, spraying lethal shrapnel across the surrounding area. A single grenade could wound or kill fighters spread out across a hidden position. And because the grenade traveled in an arc, the Viet Cong often never saw it coming. One moment, they were waiting in silence for an American patrol to walk into their ambush. The next moment, the jungle around them exploded. A grenade might land behind a tree line. Another might drop directly into a bunker entrance. Sometimes the explosion came from a direction they weren't even watching. Ambush positions that had once been carefully protected by terrain suddenly felt exposed. The psychological effect was immediate. Guerrilla fighters depended on control, choosing the moment of attack, controlling the battlefield, striking from positions of concealment. The M79 began to take that control away. Because once American patrols started carrying grenade launchers, every hidden position carried a new risk. A bunker could be destroyed without being seen. A trench could be cleared without direct fire. A tree line could be shattered by explosions before the first rifle shot was fired. And in the jungle, where visibility was often limited to just a few meters, the M79 turned every tree line into a potential death zone. As the M79 spread through American units, something unexpected began to happen on the battlefield. The weapon didn't just kill enemy fighters. It began to change how the war itself was fought. For years, Viet Cong tactics had depended on concentration and concealment. Fighters gathered in carefully prepared ambush positions, hidden inside bunkers or behind thick vegetation, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But the M79 made those positions far more dangerous. A single grenade exploding inside a bunker entrance could wipe out multiple fighters at once. A round dropped behind a tree line could scatter fragments across the entire ambush position. So the guerrillas started to adapt. Instead of clustering together, fighters began spreading out, increasing the distance between positions so a single grenade could not hit everyone at once. Bunkers were reinforced or moved deeper into the jungle. Some ambush positions were abandoned entirely. But even those adjustments didn't solve the problem. Because American patrols had begun using the M79 before the firefight even started. Imagine a Viet Cong unit preparing an ambush along a jungle trail. The fighters are hidden, silent, waiting for the Americans to walk into the kill zone. But the patrol stops. One soldier steps forward, raises the M79, and fires a grenade directly into the trees ahead. Thump! Seconds later, the explosion tears through the exact spot where the ambush was waiting to begin. The fight is over before it even starts. This tactic became increasingly common. Instead of waiting to be attacked, American patrols began firing grenades into suspicious terrain tree lines, bunkers, and patches of jungle that might conceal enemy fighters. And slowly, the advantage that the Viet Cong had relied on for years began to erode. Because the jungle had always been their greatest ally. It hid their movements. It protected their bunkers. It allowed them to strike unseen. But now, something had changed. Suddenly, the jungle itself stopped protecting them. But that wasn't the most unsettling realization. And that's when the Viet Cong realized something even worse. But the real danger of the M79 was not just the weapon itself. It was how American soldiers learned to use it. Very quickly, the launcher became more than just another firearm in the squad. Units began assigning dedicated grenadier soldiers whose primary job was to carry and operate the M79. These grenadiers didn't wait for the enemy to appear. They were used before the fight even began. Whenever a patrol approached dangerous terrain, a suspicious tree line, a cluster of bunkers, a narrow jungle trail, the grenadier would step forward and fire grenades into the area ahead. Not at visible targets, at possible targets. Into places where the enemy might be hiding. A bunker entrance, a trench line, a thick wall of vegetation. In many cases, the explosion struck the Viet Cong before the ambush was even launched. A guerrilla unit could spend hours preparing a hidden attack position, carefully selecting the terrain, digging defensive cover, and positioning fighters along the trail. But a single M79 round could land inside that position seconds before the Americans ever walked into the trap. The explosion might wound fighters, destroy bunkers, or simply force the entire unit to scatter before the ambush began. This changed the psychology of the battlefield, because now the Viet Cong could no longer assume that hiding was enough. Even if they remained unseen, even if they stayed perfectly silent, an explosion could still arrive from nowhere. They could be hit before they fired a single shot. And that realization was deeply unsettling, because the Viet Cong weren't just fighting American soldiers anymore. They were fighting explosions that could reach them anywhere. By the late years of the Vietnam War, the impact of the M79 had become clear. American patrols moving through the jungle were no longer limited to rifles and machine guns. They now carried a weapon capable of reaching enemies who believed they were completely hidden. That single change made a difference. Patrols could disrupt ambushes before they were triggered. Suspicious tree lines could be cleared with explosive rounds. Bunkers that once provided safe cover could suddenly become death traps. In many situations, the M79 gave American soldiers a crucial tactical advantage. Instead of reacting to ambushes, they could strike first, forcing guerrilla fighters to move, scatter, or abandon carefully prepared positions. And that increased the survivability of the patrols themselves. But the M79 was not a perfect weapon. Because it was a single-shot launcher, the grenadier had to reload after every shot, in the middle of a firefight. That meant the weapon could not provide sustained explosive fire. The grenadier also had to carry bulky grenades, limiting how many rounds could be brought into combat. These limitations eventually led to the development of new systems. Instead of a separate launcher carried by one soldier, engineers began designing grenade launchers that could be mounted directly under a rifle barrel. This allowed infantrymen to switch between rifle fire and explosive grenades instantly. One of the most famous of these was the M203 grenade launcher, introduced later in the war and widely used in the decades that followed. Over time, weapons like the M203 would gradually replace the M79 in frontline units. But the original launcher had already proven its value. Because the M79 wasn't perfect, but in the jungles of Vietnam, it gave American soldiers something they desperately needed: the ability to fight an invisible enemy. History often focuses on generals, strategies, and massive battles. But sometimes, the outcome of a conflict can be shaped by something much smaller: a single weapon. The M79 grenade launcher didn't win the Vietnam War, but in the dense jungles, where visibility was measured in meters and enemies could vanish behind a wall of leaves, it changed the rules of combat. Because wars aren't always decided by the largest armies or the most advanced technology. Sometimes, a single weapon placed in the right soldier's hands can completely change how a battlefield works. And the M79 did exactly that. If you enjoy stories about the weapons that shaped modern warfare, subscribe for more videos like this.